I'd like now to turn to Sheryl Hendriks. Sheryl is the head of the department and professor for food security, as well as the director of the Institute for Food, Nutrition and Wellbeing at the University of Pretoria. Sheryl will share highlights of the Africa study. Thank you, Sheryl.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Rachel. So thank you. It's my privilege and honor to be able to present the findings of the regional report that we did for Africa. And so this is the report for the particular region. But it was quite fascinating in that we started off thinking the regions would be quite different and that there was peculiarities that would stand out. But the further along we went, the more we discovered that there were lots more commonalities than we thought. And so it was my starting point that Africa would be quite different to the other regions. But we, as Fulke had explained, we used the same basis for each of the reports, but with some specific focus areas for each of the different regions. And so one of the particular components of the African report was to identify the most vulnerable people, and we put a very specific focus on looking at children and maternal health and nutrition. So that was one of the distinct components. But we particularly looked at how can we improve nutrition and contribute to the agricultural transformation agenda, which is one of the unique components in Africa. Africa lags behind in this component. And so we looked at how can science, technology, and innovation, which aligns with the focus of the African Union's policy on science, technology, and innovation, contribute to this agricultural transformation in ways particularly that improve nutrition and food systems. So in terms of Africa, African countries are still lagging behind in many ways, but yet Africa's made huge progress in reducing hunger and malnutrition, particularly since the start of the Millennium Development Goals, and has made great strides. Some countries far greater strides than other countries. So there's still pockets that need specific attention within regions and also within a country. Nigeria, for example, there's an area of Nigeria that is masked in the aggregate figures for the country. We do realize that Africa's food systems and food security is in a very fragile state. And so this is not only from the common causes that we know of, severe drought. The continent has suffered severely from El Nino and La Nina effects, and very short cycles of these effects that seem to create greater unpredictability, but also from conflict and rising cases of terrorism. And so these affect the food system in ways that we don't conventionally look at. So it's not just the natural and civil disasters, but migration, particularly in the West African side of the continent, and many of these political challenges that are faced. So we realize that the current situation is not just caused by natural disasters, but there's also a major development failure that's happened. And so the policy context is something that needs significant reform. Also, Africa is one of the youngest continents with an enormous youth bulge, and it's predicted that by 2050 the population is going to increase by 2.5 times. We need 3 times the food production we have now to feed those mouths in future. And this is also one of the instability components in the continent that needs to be looked at, particularly that this group of young people face real constraints in terms of finding employment, and so we also have to think a bit more about the entrepreneurial side of it and how can we create and develop capacity that they can enter into their own employment and contribute through that to developing the food system. Poverty, of course, is also rife in many of the countries. But yet Africa is a bit advanced in some way in that the Malabo commitments that echo the SDGs and a common agenda for Africa do set the continent aside in terms of the focus on policy reform and regional programs that look at trying to improve on food security. So the report focused on 6 main areas, which I'll run through quickly. The first was the need and the recognition that strong political commitment is needed, but that this needs to be backed by scientific evidence. And so we can see that to reach the goals of the Malabo Declarations and Africa's Agenda 2063, we need to step up the game. And especially what we need is dialogue platforms where engage constructively with policymakers in order to bring the wealth of knowledge that does exist, and particularly contextual knowledge in Africa, to the policy-making table, and how this can influence it. Sectorial and multi-institutional platforms where this sharing can happen quite constructively. One of the elements in Africa is a rapidly changing landscape in terms of land ownership, and this has major implications for the food system, and so it's something we need to look at. Africa also is not really at the moment taking advantage of ICT applications and the potential for large data, and so this is an area that needs far more attention. Along the food chain, we need to not only improve agriculture and food systems, but we need to move along the line, because that's where most of the income opportunities are going to be for these young people emerging in the future. But we recognize that science, technology, and innovation has many, many solutions that Africa is not taking advantage of. So there's no need to start from the beginning, but we can leapfrog many of those by taking ideas from the other reports on the other regions and seeing how they can be applied. But particularly, one of the neglected areas is livestock and aquaculture rearing, and also the nutrition and feeding of these systems. In Africa, also, there's often a lot of negative talk around modern biotechnology and the biosciences, and this is an area that needs to be addressed, both the policy arena as well as stepping up the infrastructure, both the human capacity as well as the physical infrastructure, to be able to engage in this and to adopt more modern breeding technologies, particularly to preserve and to protect Africa's rich diversity of food sources. So these are many of the modern breeding technologies offer opportunities to extend the life of those what we call lost crops of Africa. But also, we can also reduce inequalities, particularly by looking at the drudgery in agriculture and how technology can improve this, and particularly grant women more time for leisure as well as for doing the chores that they need to do. So farming system resilience is very important. Focusing on mixed farming systems can improve the whole farm system and can lead to greater resilience in the farming system, both at the small scale level as well as the larger agricultural sector. And also stakeholders, which include the farmers, need to work together to improve these resilience of farming systems. And we feel that some of this could be done, for example, by mapping and monitoring changes in land systems as well as in soil and water use. So there are many opportunities, especially if you can get those ICT options into the hands of farmers rather than having the data available at global level, but allowing the interaction of a two-way system to facilitate that. In terms of improving the food system and efficiency for human health and well-being, this was one area that we focused quite a lot of attention on, feeling that there's a great deal of product diversification with these nutritious crops that could be happening in Africa. Also, technology has the potential to extend the shelf life and make foods healthier and easier to prepare. So very often, if you go back to raw foods, you need greater energy input. So there's a trade-off with some of these. But how could we make those traditional foods that typically take a long time to prepare far easier to access? Africa is at the beginning of a transformation of the food system. If we don't pay attention, we will land up with a very negative food system that negatively affects health. So we can find ways of improving that. One of the major constraints to doing this in Africa is improving the storage potential and the preservation capacity particularly focusing on how we can harness solar energy in order to prevent losses in the food system. Food packaging and packaging technologies are also necessary if you're going to work on these components. Along food safety and waste reduction, this is a component that has only focused on post-harvest in Africa, but we need to look very more closely at how we can improve systems to reduce the use of chemicals, for example. How do we improve the health and the other concerns around them? On mycotoxins, a major problem. We don't really know too much about how we can reduce these mycotoxins at particularly the small scale and household level, where a lot of destruction happens from mycotoxin, and we don't particularly know what the implications are on child development, for example. We also need far more capacity to test and certify products so we can enter into international markets, but also to protect the health of the population. And there are many cheaper and rapid assessment techniques that are becoming available, but need to be adapted to the particular situation. And so in Africa, very few countries have food labeling systems, for example. So these are components that need to be looked at if we want to do that. But of course, all of this requires greater investment in human and infrastructural capacity, particularly focusing on the youth and how we can harness this and use the context in order to improve the training of scientists so they're appropriate for their specific context. So the report is quite upbeat on believing that science, technology, and innovation can overcome these challenges and transform African food systems to achieve Agenda 26, which focuses on the Africa we want. So if we take these contextual elements into consideration. Thank you.